Usually when we talk about a system failure, there's this baseline expectation of visible physical damage.
Right, like actual wreckage you can see.
Exactly. If a bridge collapses, you see the rusted steel, right?
Yeah.
You see the cracked concrete, the snapped suspension cables.
Oh, yeah. The structural engineer can literally just point at the debris and say, there it is. That right there is where the physics failed.
It's entirely binary.
It is. It's structural. It's either broken or not broken.
Yeah.
You can measure the tensile strength of the steel or calculate the weight of the vehicles and map exactly where the physical reality deviated from the mathematical model. It's very clean.
And it is deeply comforting. I mean, we like things to be visible. We like failure to be neatly categorized in a way our eyes and our hands can process.
It makes sense to us biologically.
Right. But then you step into the modern corporate enterprise. You step into a skyscraper full of thousands of people, and suddenly that traditional diagnostic toolkit is completely useless.
Totally obsolete.
You're looking at a multi-billion-dollar organizational landscape that is, honestly, it's an illusion.
It really is. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Mm-hmm.
Because when a massive logistics company or, say, a tech giant begins to fail, the failure isn't made of cracked concrete.
Right.
It isn't a snapped cable. It is made of syllables.
Wow. Okay, so welcome back to The Deep Dive. This is part 2 of our 8-part series, and we are thrilled to have you with us again.
Glad to be here.
If you were here for part 1, you probably remember we diagnosed the massive structural collapse of legacy systems.
Yeah, the hard infrastructure.
Exactly. We looked at the Nokia case study, and we mapped out what researchers are currently calling the $9.6 trillion entropy leak.
Which is just a staggering number to even think about.
It really is. We were looking at the hard structural pipelines where energy just bleeds out of the modern workforce.
Right. So in part 1, we were evaluating the structural failure of human organization, the pipes themselves. But today, the mission is shifting. We are transitioning from diagnosing structural failure to unpacking something that I would argue is much more insidious. We are talking about linguistic failure.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start, because the premise of today's source material, it fundamentally challenges how we think about management.
It completely flips it.
Our focus today is Chapter 2 of Juha Hotunen's 2026 work from the Physis Research Group.
Yeah.
And the chapter is titled The Lexical Phase Shift, Why Metaphors Fail. And the core argument here is just staggering.
It really makes you rethink every meeting you've ever been in.
Totally. Hotunen posits that the modern enterprise isn't just suffering from bad management or poor product market fit. It is suffering from a literal, measurable linguistic hallucination.
Hallucination is the exact clinical term for what is happening here.
Right.
We are operating in these complex corporate environments where the vocabulary we use to manage physical reality it's completely detached from the laws of physics.
We're talking about corporate metaphors, words like synergy, bandwidth, culture, low-hanging fruit.
The classics.
Right. And Hotunen is arguing these are not just annoying office jargon. I mean, we all know they're annoying.
Oh, definitely.
If you're listening to this right now, you probably have a visceral reaction to the phrase, let's circle back.
I'm cringing just hearing it.
Right. But this research says they are more than just irritants. They are physical, cognitive hazards. They cause catastrophic, measurable energy loss.
Because if a concept cannot be described by a physical equation, it is merely sociological alchemy.
Sociological alchemy. I love that phrasing.
It's magical thinking. You cannot engineer a solution to a bad vibe.
No.
Thermodynamics, as the source text ruthlessly points out, simply does not care about your corporate culture. It only cares about energy, mass, and displacement.
It feels like we've walked into this incredibly complex, high-stakes control room of a nuclear power plant.
Okay, yeah.
But all the labels on the buttons and the levers are written in complete gibberish.
Right, like an alien language.
Exactly. We're pushing a button labeled vibes or alignment and expecting a physical reactor core to cool down.
And when it doesn't work, we just push the alignment button harder.
Yes. Which naturally leads to the question, why do incredibly smart, highly educated people build these broken control rooms?
That is the $1 million question, or I guess the $40 billion question.
Right. Why do seasoned executives build massive logistical systems based on alchemy?
Well, The text suggests it starts with the very words they use.
Right.
And to illustrate this, Hatunen drops us into this incredible, almost cinematic scene.
It's such a good scene.
It's 8:14 a.m. in Zurich, and we're introduced to the CEO of a $40 billion logistics conglomerate.
The text just calls him 8, right?
Yeah, internally referred to just as 8. So 8 is sitting in this glass-walled boardroom, and he's watching his strategic architecture just dissolve into total noise.
Because of the presentation.
Exactly. His chief strategy officer is at the front of the room, projecting this massive slide deck, attempting to lay out the quarterly strategy.
Right, the typical corporate morning.
But the CSO is relying entirely on these empty, gaseous phrases. He actually says, and this is a direct quote from the transcript of that meeting, "We are lacking bandwidth. We need to synergize our deliverables, lean into the culture, and capture the low-hanging fruit to establish a new normal."
Wow. I mean, it is a masterclass in saying absolutely nothing.
It's completely hollow.
And 8, the CEO, has this dramatic, almost violent reaction to it.
It really does.
He doesn't raise his hand to ask a clarifying question. He doesn't ask the CSO to elaborate on any of that.
No, he abruptly severs the presentation feed.
He reaches over and physically cuts the power to the deck.
The boardroom just goes dark.
Because he realizes in that exact moment that his executive team isn't diagnosing the actual failure of their flagship autonomous delivery nodes.
Right. They are experiencing a collective semantic hallucination.
He realizes they are trying to engineer a literal physical system, a global logistics network involving metal, silicon, diesel fuel, and, human caloric energy using the unconstrained vocabulary of poetry.
Which is just mathematically impossible.
Hey, I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the severity of this. Is this basically like trying to program a complex software system, like a routing algorithm, using a Shakespearean sonnet?
That is exactly the mechanism at play.
The machine literally cannot process the instructions.
Precisely. A sonnet, like a corporate metaphor, possesses infinite interpretations.
Right.
The beauty of poetry is its ambiguity. But in a closed mechanical system, infinite interpretations equate to zero operational boundaries.
Because the machine needs exact values.
Exactly. If I tell a software engineer to make the code more poetic or to lean into the culture of the code, that engineer has absolutely no physical constraints to work within.
They're just guessing.
They don't know if they should rewrite the database schema, change the user interface, or just format the text differently. They are perpetually fighting ghosts. I'm trying to visualize what this looks like for a manager on the ground, if I'm understanding this right, using words like synergy or vibe to fix a broken global supply chain. It's like being tasked with driving a massive, fully loaded semi-truck down a steep, winding mountain road.
Okay, I like this.
But when you look at the dashboard of the truck, it doesn't show you the RPMs, it doesn't show you the engine temperature or the brake fluid levels or even your speed. The entire dashboard has just been replaced by a single giant gauge that only points to good vibes or bad vibes.
You literally cannot steer the vehicle under those conditions.
Exactly.
If that gauge suddenly drops to bad vibes, what is your mechanical input? Do you slam on the brakes? Do you accelerate? Do you pull over and change the oil?
You have no idea.
You have zero actionable telemetry. The driver is reduced to just guessing, which, as you can imagine, inevitably leads to a catastrophic crash. Which brings up a really heavy scientific concept that the text uses to anchor this entire argument.
Oh, yes. The linguistics angle.
Right. It's called linguistic relativity, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
A fascinating concept.
Now, I have heard of this before, mostly in the context of, anthropology or linguistics.
Right.
The classic example is how certain indigenous languages have dozens of words for snow, or how some languages don't have words for left and right, but use cardinal directions like north and south instead.
Right, which physically changes how they orient themselves in space.
Exactly. But applying Sapir-Whorf to a corporate boardroom is a whole different level.
It is deeply unsettling when you apply it to the allocation of capital.
Yeah.
In cognitive science, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis dictates that the lexical structure of a language mathematically limits a native speaker's perception and their systemic categorization of reality.
This is not just a description.
No, language doesn't just describe your thoughts after you have them. Language constructs the literal architecture of your consciousness.
So it dictates what you are physically capable of paying attention to.
Exactly.
The text mentions empirical studies confirming that linguistic patterns unconsciously dictate a speaker's attentional biases and their temporal reasoning.
Right.
So if your organization's language is strictly qualitative, if everything is synergy and vibe and North Star, the mental models of the leadership detach entirely from material constraints.
Because words define the boundaries of reality.
Wow.
If you do not have a specific mechanistic word for a specific mechanical failure, your brain physically cannot process that the failure is happening.
You just miss it entirely.
You just feel a vague sense of unease. You notice the quarterly numbers are down, and you call it bad culture.
Right.
And this isn't just theoretical philosophy either. Hotunen cites a rigorous operational analysis originating from Cornell University that looked specifically at this phenomenon in the Fortune 500.
Okay, let's hear the data.
They examined the penetration of what academia formally defines as corporate bullshit.
I have to admit, seeing corporate bullshit used as a rigorous, quantified academic metric is incredibly satisfying.
It really is great.
They define it as semantically empty, misleadingly impressive jargon. But the findings of the Cornell study are not funny at all.
No, they're quite alarming.
They're actually devastating for anyone running a business.
The empirical reality is that personnel who are highly susceptible to corporate speak, so the managers who buy into the jargon, who use it fluently, who reward it in meetings,
Right.
are quantifiably worse at executing practical, high-leverage business decisions.
So it isn't just that these people are annoying to listen to.
No, it goes much deeper.
Their actual cognitive apparatus for making logical, physical decisions is degraded by the language they consume.
It's like feeding a high-performance engine contaminated fuel.
Yes.
The engine doesn't just run poorly. The internal components begin to literally warp.
Because when an executive strategy relies on chasing a, quote, North Star, it corrupts the logic of the enterprise.
Completely. Think about what a North Star actually is.
It is a ball of burning gas trillions of miles away. It provides zero instructions on how to allocate a $50 million quarterly budget.
None at all.
It provides no framework for mitigating supply chain friction in Southeast Asia. It is a navigational aid for wooden ships in the 17th century, not a strategic operational framework.
That's such a great point. So, to fix this, CEO 8 forces his leadership team into what Hotunen calls a lexical phase shift.
Yes, a total reboot.
He mandates an immediate, brutal change in vocabulary. He actually tells his team, a deep dive is an action performed by marine mammals. Surprise and delight is an emotional state, not a product tolerance.
I love that. He's just so literal.
He forces them to abandon metaphors entirely and adopt absolute mechanical terminology. And the text provides this tool called the phase shift translation matrix.
Which is an incredible framework.
It really maps these soft, gaseous words to their brutal physical realities. We need to look at a few of these because they fundamentally change how you hear these words in your own office. Let's start with synergy. It is arguably the most abused word in the corporate lexicon.
Well, without a doubt. We need to find synergies between the sales and marketing teams.
The translation matrix completely strips that down. It argues that synergy merely describes the spatial presence of two distinct operational groups.
Okay, spatial presence.
Right. It completely fails to define the required energy transfer to successfully merge discrete systems.
So saying we need synergy is like putting a massive V8 car engine and a transmission in the same empty room and saying, look, synergy.
Exactly.
Without ever engineering the bolts, the drive shaft, the fluid lines, or the gear ratios to actually connect them.
Because spatial proximity is not operational integration.
Right.
When an executive demands synergy, they're simply abdicating the hard work of engineering the connection.
They're passing the buck.
Exactly. The next one on the matrix is bandwidth, as in, I don't have the bandwidth for this project right now.
Which we all use to mean, I don't have time on my calendar, or I am too busy.
But look at the physical truth the matrix reveals. Using bandwidth to describe calendar availability completely ignores the hard biological limits of human cognitive processing and ATP generation.
Right, because we aren't machines.
Bandwidth is a measurement of synthetic data transfer, like a fiber optic cable transmitting gigabytes of static data.
Yeah.
It reduces a biological human brain, which is subject to metabolic exhaustion, to a synthetic wire.
Then there is low-hanging fruit. I am incredibly guilty of this one, honestly.
Well, all right.
Let's grab the low-hanging fruit first, get some quick wins.
The matrix translates this as operational tasks requiring minimal immediate caloric expenditure.
Wow.
But what is the kinetic impact on the enterprise? Using this phrase actively obscures total systemic friction and long-term opportunity cost.
Because by focusing entirely on what requires the least calories right now, you are willfully ignoring the massive structural decay happening to the tree itself.
Yes.
You're picking an apple while the roots are rotting.
Exactly, and the data backs up how destructive this environment is. Analysts tracking communication in these highly stratified corporate hierarchies found that 85% of white-collar sentiment toward jargon is intensely negative.
85%.
Yeah.
People despise this language
They really do.
because, as Hotunen points out, words like circle back do not streamline operations.
Yeah.
They destroy signal clarity. They stall execution velocity.
Think about the physical cost of circling back.
Yeah.
It forces human beings to waste literal kinetic energy, typing, scheduling, just seeking clarification on what was actually said in the first place.
Just to figure out what the meeting was about.
Exactly. And we really have to address the accelerating threat that the text highlights here, generative AI.
Yes, the AI angle in Chapter 2 is fascinating. We usually think of AI as this massive productivity multiplier, right?
We do. But in the context of linguistic relativity, generative AI models are currently saturating corporate networks with statistically probable but operationally void words.
Like what?
Words like leverage, optimize, facilitate, streamline. AI language models do not understand physics. They do not understand thermodynamics. They simply predict the next most likely word in a sequence based on vast oceans of past corporate speak scraped from the internet.
So they are effectively flooding the zone with semantic void.
Exactly.
They are automating the generation of corporate bullshit at a scale we have never seen before.
They are drastically accelerating the linguistic hallucination.
But a business is not a statistical text model.
No.
A business is a literal physical system.
Yeah.
It consumes capital, it outputs products, and it dissipates waste. Thermodynamics does not care about your statistically probable, perfectly polite email draft.
It doesn't care at all.
If the words don't map to physical reality, the system breaks.
Which demands a critical transition in our diagnostic.
Right.
If we realize that soft words cause us to misdiagnose reality at the executive level, how does that translate down to the actual physical labor the employees are doing?
Right. From the boardroom to the floor.
We have to move from the words spoken in the boardroom to the physical actions taken at the desk.
This takes us to the second massive concept in Hotunen's work, the delusion of effort.
This is a huge one.
And I want to ask you directly as you are listening to this, think about your own calendar right now. Look at your meetings for tomorrow. How many of them are designed to actually achieve a physical result, and how many are just scheduled effort?
This is where the physical consequences of a broken lexicon become painfully measurable on a balance sheet.
Let's go back to 8, our CEO in Zurich. We were at 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday when he cut the power to the projector.
Right.
Now, the text jumps to Friday, 11:30 p.m. 8 is sitting in his office, reviewing the bi-weekly sprint data for his autonomous delivery nodes.
Okay.
His elite engineering division has just logged a collective 4,200 hours of overtime in a single month.
4,200 hours. Consider the sheer biological toll of that number.
It's massive.
That is an astronomical amount of human exertion.
And the chief human resources officer comes into 8's office with a proposal. They want to create a discretionary bonus pool to recognize the engineering team's, quote, immense work and dedication.
Which sounds totally reasonable.
And on the surface, that makes perfect sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
People stayed late. They sweated, they suffered, they sacrificed their evenings and weekends. The natural, empathetic human response is to reward them.
Of course it is. But 8 looks at the project timeline on his dashboard.
Right.
He looks at the code committed and the hardware integrated. The delivery date for the autonomous nodes had not advanced a single day.
Not a single.
The product was in the exact same state it was a month ago. So 8 denies the bonus instantly.
He just says no. And the HR officer is, understandably, appalled.
Oh, completely shocked.
But Hotunen writes something chilling to explain 8's logic. He writes, the engineers weren't working, they were simply vibrating in place.
It is a profound diagnostic realization. 8 recognizes that his executive team, and specifically his HR department, is fundamentally confusing psychological strain with mechanical output.
They're confusing the two.
To avert systemic collapse, an organization must undergo an epistemic phase shift. It must ruthlessly transition from qualitative poetry to quantitative physics. And nowhere is this more critical than in how we define the word work.
This brings in the absolute mathematics of work. Because in physical science, a word possesses one uncompromising definition.
Yes.
There is no semantic drift. In HR, the definition of work is effort. You sit at your desk until midnight, you endure profound psychological friction, you fire off 50 emails, you join 6 Zoom calls.
All of that feels like work.
Right. Management sees the sweat, they see the exertion, the exhaustion, and they praise you for your hard work.
Physics strictly rejects this hallucination.
How so?
Let us look at classical mechanics. Work, represented by the variable W, is mathematically defined as force, F, multiplied by displacement, or distance, D. The equation is W equals F times D.
And work is force times distance.
Exactly. Now, apply this to the corporate environment. If an employee expends massive effort, let's say they are pushing against an immovable operational obstacle, like a hostile legal department,
Well, we've all been there.
or they're attending consecutive synchronous meetings that resolve absolutely nothing. Or they are wrestling with fundamentally broken, undocumented legacy software. They are undeniably applying force,
Yeah.
and they are undeniably expending energy.
They're exhausted, their heart rate is elevated, their cortisol is spiking, their brain is burning massive amounts of glucose.
If no mass is moved, if the project does not advance across a measurable, observable distance, if the code is not shipped or the product is not built,
Right.
then the displacement, the variable D, equals 0.
And if D equals 0, then mathematically W equals F times 0.
Mhm.
And anything multiplied by 0 is 0. The employee has done exactly 0 work.
They have exerted immense effort, but they have accomplished 0 work.
I want to use an analogy here to make sure this is crystal clear, because it completely reframes how we view productivity.
So for it.
It is exactly like flooring the gas pedal of a heavy diesel truck that is stuck in a pit of deep mud.
Okay, visual.
The driver is pushing the pedal to the floor. The engine is redlining at 5,000 RPM. You are burning massive amounts of diesel fuel. The tires are spinning at incredibly high speeds, throwing mud everywhere.
But the truck does not move an inch forward.
Exactly. You haven't done any actual work on the world. You haven't transported the cargo from point A to point B. You've just created a ton of noise and, more importantly, a massive amount of heat.
Waste heat. This is where the thermodynamic consequences become inescapable.
Right.
Effort without displacement is not work. It is merely the generation of waste heat. And to understand why this destroys companies, we have to look at the first and second laws of thermodynamics.
Let's break that down without getting too bogged down in textbook definitions. What does the first law actually tell us about those 4,200 hours of overtime?
Well, the first law dictates the absolute conservation of energy within a system.
Meaning energy isn't created or destroyed?
Exactly. Energy cannot be magically destroyed. It doesn't just vanish into the ether. So that massive amount of human energy the engineers expended, the caloric energy, the biological ATP, the electricity to run the servers, it didn't disappear.
Okay.
But because that energy failed to convert into kinetic motion because it didn't move the project forward, it had to degrade into a lower quality state.
Which triggers the second law of thermodynamics.
Yes. The second law states that energy inevitably flows in the direction of decay unless directed by a constraint.
Entropy.
Exactly. Quantified mathematically as entropy. High temperature thermal energy of that stressed, gridlocked, exhausted employee is simply dissipated into molecular disorder. The energy becomes useless.
Wow.
Organizations are physically bound by this reality. When management praises effort instead of measuring literal work, they are literally subsidizing thermal decay.
Subsidizing thermal decay. You are paying people bonuses to slowly melt the company down into chaos.
That is exactly what is happening.
You are looking at the spinning tires of the truck, saying, wow, look how fast those wheels are moving. Give that driver a raise, while the truck sinks deeper into the mud.
It's absurd when you look at it that way.
Huttunen notes that thermodynamic entropy is a perfect analog for the decay of hierarchical corporate structures. A firm naturally decays into chaos unless there is a constant, deliberate input of external energy that restores mechanical order. When you reward effort that lacks displacement, you are actively feeding the entropic machine.
Let us look at what Ait found when he audited those 4,200 hours of overtime.
What did he find?
He refused to look at the effort. He looked for the friction. And the data revealed that 88% of that time was spent battling incompatible API protocols between two siloed databases.
So they weren't building They were literally pushing against a brick wall.
They were applying immense force against a rigid structural barrier. They were burning biological energy and corporate capital, but achieving zero spatial movement. And by rewarding this exact behavior in the past with discretionary bonuses, the HR department had inadvertently incentivized the generation of friction.
Oh, because they paid them for it before.
Exactly. They taught the engineers that suffering was valued more than displacement.
So 8 implements an epistemic phase shift. He uncouples compensation from hours logged entirely. It no longer matters if you sit at your desk for 20 hours a day.
Not at all.
He ties compensation strictly to verified project displacement. You only get paid, you only get bonuses if mass is moved, if the truck gets out of the mud.
What's fascinating here is if we connect this to the bigger picture, leaders must demand literal mathematical work.
Yeah.
They must use what Hutunen calls the output matrix to visually distinguish between energy expended and mass moved. If you have pure exertion, W equals F times 0. Zero mass is moved, the energy converts to waste heat, and employee burnout accelerates exponentially.
But hold on. I can hear people listening to this and thinking, okay, I understand the math. I know I am subsidizing waste heat by rewarding zero displacement effort. But how do I actually fix the machinery of the business? I can't just tell my employees to move mass and expect the friction to disappear.
Right, it's not that simple.
We have to translate these abstract, poetic HR concepts into their biological and thermodynamic realities so we can actually engineer solutions.
And this brings us to the most practical application of Hutunen's work, the Multiphysics Dictionary.
Okay, let's dive into this.
This is the epistemic mandate. The modern executive must dismantle the corporate vocabulary and replace it with literal physical, thermodynamic, and biological equivalents.
This part of the research completely changed my perspective because it takes 4 of the most common, everyday HR problems that every manager deals with, and it proves that they aren't emotional problems at all.
They are structural.
They are biological and physical failure states. Let's go through these 4 translations in detail, starting with the biggest one. Translation 1, burnout.
In the corporate world, burnout is universally categorized as an emotional failing.
Oh, totally.
It is treated as a psychological redness, a lack of resilience, or a failure to balance one's life. And how do corporate HR departments treat it?
With soft interventions.
Exactly. Wellness retreats, mandatory meditation apps, Friday afternoon yoga sessions in the break room.
Just do some deep breathing exercises, take a mental health day, and you'll be fine to tackle the massive, unyielding workload on Monday.
It is a profound, destructive misunderstanding of the human machine.
Yeah.
The multiphysics framework states clearly, burnout is not an emotional state. It is a literal dielectric breakdown.
Dielectric breakdown. Okay, I am not an electrical engineer. Explain what that means in the physical world, and then let's map it to the brain.
In electrical engineering, dielectric breakdown occurs when an insulating material fails to prevent the flow of current under applied electrical stress.
Like insulation on a wire.
Right. Imagine a standard copper wire, the kind inside your walls, wrapped in a rubber insulation jacket. The rubber is the dielectric material. It keeps the electricity safely inside the wire.
Makes sense.
If you pump too much voltage through that wire, more voltage than the rubber is rated to handle the high electrical stress, violently punctures the insulator.
It just tears through it.
The rubber literally melts or tears. You get permanent structural damage, a total loss of insulating properties, and the electrical current just arcs out uncontrollably, starting a fire or shorting the circuit.
And engineers can measure exactly when this will happen, right? They know the exact tolerance of the rubber.
Yes, using highly calibrated instruments and statistical Weibull analysis, they can determine the exact failure voltage of any material.
Okay.
But here is the critical leap Hutunen makes. The human nervous system operates on these exact same biophysical principles.
This is where it gets heavy into the biology, but it is so crucial. Walk us through the biological equivalent of that copper wire.
Nerve impulses in your brain are transmitted across your neural architecture via electrical signals called action potentials.
Right.
To ensure these high-speed electrical signals don't just leak out into the surrounding brain tissue, the wires of your brain, the axons, are wrapped in a fatty insulating coating.
The myelin sheath.
Exactly. The myelin sheath functions identically to the synthetic polymer insulation on a commercial wire.
Wow.
Non-neuronal cells in your brain, called oligodendrocytes, spin dozens of layers of this compacted membrane around the axon. This insulation forces the electrical potential to leap rapidly between microscopic gaps, allowing for high-speed cognition.
So it keeps the signal moving fast.
Yes. Your brain is continuously discharging a transmembrane potential of roughly 0.1 volts at hyperspeed.
So if that is the baseline state of the brain, what happens when a manager piles on an insane amount of operational stress? Let's say a manager says, hey, I need you to run these 5 complex projects simultaneously, manage a remote team across 3 time zones, and answer Slack messages every 2 minutes.
We've all had that boss.
Right. What is physically happening to the myelin?
Hutunen gives us another case study from 8 to illustrate this. 2 of his lead software architects abruptly resign, citing burnout.
Okay.
The HR officer immediately suggests implementing a mental health Friday for the remaining team.
Classic.
8 rejects it outright, stating, yoga cannot repair a violently punctured lipid insulator.
He is ruthless.
When an employee is subjected to chronic, unrelenting operational stress, that cognitive load acts exactly as an applied high-voltage electrical stressor.
You are literally pumping too much voltage through the biological wire.
Yes. And under excessive repetitive voltage, the biological insulation simply fails. Chronic stress causes a mathematical defect in master genes in your body, specifically a gene called the early growth response gene 2, or EGR2.
Okay, EGR2.
This gene is essential to the assembly and maintenance of myelin.
Wait. So the stress literally turns off the gene that builds your brain's insulation.
It mathematically degrades it. And as the myelin literally breaks down, the electrical capacitance of the axonal membrane increases. It takes more time to charge and discharge.
Because the insulation is gone.
Exactly. The electrical signals in your brain physically leak and dissipate into the surrounding tissue. This slows your cognition, impairs your working memory, destroys your ability to regulate emotion, and results in complete systemic failure.
So the employee hasn't lost their motivation. Their neural architecture has suffered a dielectric breakdown because management applied an operational voltage that mathematically exceeded the biological material's structural limits.
Exactly right.
You cannot fix a melted wire with a Friday pizza party or a subscription to a meditation app.
It's physiologically impossible.
You have to actually audit the operational voltage. You have to limit the stress cycling to allow the EGR2 master genes to synthesize and repair the myelin architecture. You need enforced, non-negotiable disconnect periods where 0 voltage is applied.
Precisely. You must engineer systemic grounding. You must lower the voltage.
That reframes so much of the modern workplace guilt. Okay, let's move to translation number 2, because this one redefines every massive corporate restructure or change management seminar I've ever seen. Translation 2, resistance to change.
Oh, this is a big one. When a massive digital transformation fails, which happens frequently, executives routinely blame resistance to change.
Always.
They characterize the workforce as stubborn, lazy, entrenched in legacy thinking, or unwilling to learn. They assume resistance is a behavioral choice or a bad attitude.
They just aren't team players. They don't want to get with the program.
Right. But the Multiphysics Dictionary translates resistance to change into biological active inference.
Okay, active inference.
And it demonstrates that resistance is governed by the relentless thermodynamic pursuit of ATP adenosine triphosphate, the fundamental energy currency of the biological cell.
I've read a bit of Carl Friston's work on this. Is this the idea that our brains are basically prediction machines?
Yes, exactly.
That we evolved to hate surprises because on the savannah, a surprise usually meant a predator, so it meant death. So we hoard energy to keep our worldview and our predictive models stable.
You have grasped the core mechanism perfectly.
Okay.
Carl Friston is a theoretical neuroscientist, and his framework of active inference describes how biological systems survive. A biological agent, like a human being, maintains its structural integrity by constantly predicting the states of the world and acting to minimize surprise or variational free energy in its dynamic environment.
We want the world to match our internal model.
Exactly.
So if I am an employee, my brain builds a highly detailed model of my corporate world, how the legacy software works, who my boss is, what my daily tasks are, who I need to CC on an email to get an approval.
Right.
And my brain desperately wants that model to remain stable.
Within this physics-based framework, resistance is formally defined as resilience as inertia. It is the mathematically proven ability of a system to resist change in its structure when subjected to disturbing external forces. Humans have high-precision internal beliefs, which act as strong priors that forcefully resist being updated.
But let me push back here. Why do we resist updating them so strongly? Is it really just evolutionary stubbornness?
No, no. It is pure thermodynamics. Updating an internal model carries a massive metabolic penalty.
It costs calories.
Yes. Friston's variational free energy is decomposed mathematically into complexity minus accuracy. To put that in plain terms, the brain fundamentally seeks to minimize complexity because erasing previous information and rewiring neural pathways is exceptionally expensive in terms of metabolic energy, in terms of ATP. The human brain is a biological engine optimizing for physical survival by hoarding energy.
So when CEO 8 tried to overhaul the routing software for his autonomous fleet, and the regional directors actively rebelled and clung to the old, clunky legacy dashboard,
Yes.
he initially viewed them as insubordinate. But applying this framework, he realized he was effectively demanding that thousands of employee brains expend vast amounts of ATP to rewrite their deeply entrenched predictive models.
Precisely.
The human hardware was forcefully rejecting the new software simply to conserve caloric energy.
Resistance to change is not an HR problem. It is a strict thermodynamic boundary condition. The workforce defaults to simpler, older models that don't diverge from prior beliefs to avoid the massive metabolic drain of overfitting new data.
But this raises an incredibly important question. If we know that change costs physical calories and biology actively fights change to survive, how do we ever change anything?
It's a great question.
How does a company ever innovate if the biological hardware rejects it?
The text provides highly actionable takeaways for this. First, you must fund the caloric cost of change. If you want the organization to change, you must provide the physical, temporal, and informational subsidies necessary to fund the metabolic cost of updating those beliefs. You cannot demand they learn a new system while maintaining their old operational quota.
You have to lower their other workload so their brain has the ATP available to rewrite the model.
Exactly. And second, you must minimize variational free energy. Do not introduce massive, chaotic restructures that maximize surprise.
Right.
Introduce operational changes sequentially in highly predictable phases, allowing the biological neural networks time to update without triggering extreme spikes in energy demand.
You treat inertia as a feature of survival, not a bug of laziness.
Beautifully said.
Okay, translation 3, communication breakdown.
We have all experienced the corporate game of telephone.
Oh, yeah.
The CEO says one thing at a global town hall, and by the time that message filters down through the VPs, the directors, the managers to the frontline workers, it is a completely different, garbled, often contradictory message. Corporate leaders often view this as a failure of alignment or a lack of leadership charisma.
We just need to communicate the vision more clearly. We need more impactful slides.
But the translation matrix maps communication breakdown directly to informational entropy, and it references Claude Shannon's 1948 mathematical theory of communication.
Okay, bringing in Shannon.
Shannon proved that if the channel capacity is mathematically lower than the informational entropy of the message will inevitably degrade.
It has to.
This is not a theory. It is an inviolable law of physics. No amount of executive charisma can overcome a fundamentally low signal-to-noise ratio.
The text describes the corporate hierarchy as a Markov chain. I need you to explain that in a way that doesn't sound like a statistics textbook. What is a Markov chain in the context of an office?
A Markov chain describes a sequence of events where the probability of each event depends only on the state attained in the previous event.
Okay, so
Think of it like a chain of people passing a physical object, but they can only see the person directly handing it to them. In a deep corporate hierarchy, information flow is a Markov chain.
right.
The CEO transmits to the VP transmits to the director to the manager to the front line. Each successive layer of management exponentially reduces the mutual information shared between the original executive input and the final output.
And this ties into the information bottleneck principle.
Yes. Originally applied to optimize deep neural networks in artificial intelligence, this principle dictates that as information passes through hierarchical layers, the intermediate representations must continuously compress the signal.
Because they can't pass all of it on.
Exactly. The bottleneck forces intermediate managers to filter, compress, and transmit only what they deem relevant, discarding the rest to meet the cognitive and temporal capacity limits of their local channel.
So the message isn't just misunderstood because people weren't paying attention. It is mathematically destroyed by the architecture of the middle management.
It's physically erased.
Every layer you add to an organization literally deletes data. It is structural data loss.
Which is why the solution is not better culture or more town halls. The solution is structural engineering. Executives must build skip connections.
The KIP connections.
In deep neural networks, engineers prevent signal degradation by building skip connections that bypass intermediate layers entirely. Executives must do the exact same thing. They must communicate raw, low-entropy, purely mathematical data directly to the front line without intermediate managerial compression.
You must flatten the Markov chain.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly highly controversial. Translation 4. Silos.
Yes.
Because for the last 20 years, every business consultant, every management book, every open plan office designer has preached the exact same gospel. We need to smash the silos, break down the walls, open communication, cross-functional collaboration.
It is practically a religion in Silicon Valley.
It is. And according to organizational multiphysics, that legacy advice is mathematically and biologically dangerous. The text translates silos into Markov blankets.
Right.
Okay, what is a Markov blanket? Because it sounds incredibly cozy, but knowing this text, it is heavy statistical physics.
In statistical physics and computational neurobiology, a Markov blanket is a strict boundary that separates the internal states of a system from the chaotic, high-entropy external states of its environment.
Okay.
It acts as a semi-permeable thermodynamic membrane. It consists entirely of sensory states, which receive external inputs, and active states, which broadcast outputs back to the environment.
So it is a protective shield around a team.
Exactly. By acting as a protective membrane, the blanket establishes conditional independence.
What does that mean for a team?
This means the internal dynamics of a specific system, like an elite software engineering team or a deep research legal team, are statistically insulated from external variance. The silo actively restricts the volume of sensory data its internal nodes must process. It explicitly shields their localized, finite, metabolic energy budgets.
Let me push back on this because it sounds like a recipe for total gridlock.
Sure.
If we have impenetrable silos, nobody collaborates. How do things get done? Why shouldn't a marketing person be able to just walk over to the engineering bay, tap a developer on the shoulder, and ask a quick question about a feature timeline? It's just a conversation.
Let's look at 8's failure here to understand why that tap on the shoulder is destructive.
Yeah.
8 nearly destroyed his engineering division early on by mandating an open-door collaboration policy with the global marketing team. He demanded unconstrained transparency. He smashed the silos.
He did what all the consultants said to do.
Exactly. But by forcibly dissolving the Markov blanket, the engineers were instantly flooded with unpredicted variance. Shifting marketing priorities, synchronous brainstorming meetings, endless Slack notifications about campaign launches.
And because we know from the active inference discussion earlier that processing surprises costs biological ATP.
Yes. Because processing chaotic noise requires physical energy, the engineers were forced into a state of context thrashing.
Context thrash.
They had to continuously erase and rewrite their working memory. And in information physics, this process of erasing data is strictly bound by Landauer's principle.
Okay, Landauer's principle. The text throws around some heavy formulas here. It mentions KT natural log of 2. What does that actually mean for me sitting at my desk?
Rolf Landauer formulated this in 1961. Landauer's principle dictates that every physical erasure of information dissipates heat and drains cellular ATP.
Seriously?
Yes, there is a minimum amount of physical energy required to erase one bit of information from a system. The formula is KT times the natural log of 2, where K is Boltzmann's constant and T is temperature.
But what that means for you, practically, is this. Your brain is a processor. Every single time an engineer gets a random, irrelevant Slack message from marketing, their brain has to process it, realize it is irrelevant to their current complex coding task, and then actively erase it from their working memory to return to the code.
And that literal act of erasure burns physical calories and generates micro amounts of heat in their brain.
Exactly. Destroying the silo overloaded the engineer's biological active inference engines. It led directly to metabolic depletion, forcing the division into an energetically dead state of high systemic entropy or energy.
So the noise was literally cooking them.
Wasting their brain's processor cycles on noise was literally cooking the neural architecture.
So we shouldn't smash silos, we should rebuild them.
Yes.
But again, to my earlier pushback, how do they talk to each other? If marketing needs a timeline, how do they get it without causing a dielectric breakdown in the engineering department? 8 realized his error and rebuilt the membranes. To achieve lateral velocity, an organization cannot rely on impenetrable brick walls. It must engineer what the text calls translucent blankets.
Translucent blank.
A translucent blanket is a structurally modified Markov blanket where the active and sensory states are explicitly calibrated as strict application programming interfaces, or APIs.
Like software APIs.
Exactly. Instead of an open door where anyone can walk in and yell, you have a defined protocol. Subsystem A must interact only with subsystem B's API.
So marketing can't just brainstorm with engineering. Marketing has to submit a standardized ticket with specific, rigidly defined parameters and engineering processes that ticket asynchronously without ever seeing the chaotic brainstorming that led to the ticket.
Exactly.
But isn't that just creating bureaucracy? It sounds like we're replacing bad language with massive amounts of red tape. Doesn't that kill the velocity we just talked about?
It feels like red tape if you view it through a sociological lens. But through a thermodynamic lens, you are protecting the cortical glucose of your elite operators. You filter out macroscopic noise at the silo boundary, so your high-leverage nodes do not expend metabolic ATP, endlessly erasing and rewriting irrelevant data. The perceived bureaucracy at the boundary is actually the thermal shielding that allows the internal engine to run at maximum velocity without overheating.
That just reframes everything. Burnout is a blown fuse. Resistance is biological energy conservation. Miscommunication is a mathematical law of deep hierarchies. And silos are life-saving thermodynamic membranes.
It changes the whole paradigm.
It completely removes the moral judgment from management. It's not about employees being good or bad or lazy. It is strictly about whether the physics of the environment supports biological life.
Which brings us perfectly to the macro level of this diagnostic. We've looked at the micro level of the human brain's myelin. We've looked at the team level of silos and Markov blankets.
Right.
But what happens when an entire multi-billion-dollar corporation operates purely on metaphor? What happens when an entire company scales linguistic hallucination and ignores the physics we just discussed?
This takes us to section 4, the macro case study, the WeWork implosion. And He Tin opens the section with one final scene featuring CEO 8.
Right. It's 7:00 a.m. in Zurich. 8 is staring at a proposed expansion deck for his autonomous logistics network.
Another deck?
His CFO has presented a financial model designed to acquire rapid venture capital. The deck promises a capital-light, flexible community of supply chain hubs, and it boasts this incredibly high adjusted profitability margin.
But 8 spots the semantic fraud immediately. The CFO had quietly stripped out the cost of the physical warehouses, the charging grids, the maintenance staff, the real estate, the actual physical mass of the business to make the numbers look like a high-margin software company.
8 drops the deck on the glass table and says coldly, "You have engineered a semantic void. You are handing me a community-adjusted EBITDA. You are building me a WeWork."
Wow. To understand the catastrophic devastation of abandoning physics for metaphor, the text dissects the 2019 implosion of WeWork under its founder, Adam Neumann. And it states clearly, WeWork was built on a foundation of unrestrained lexical hallucination.
Completely unrestricted.
It wasn't a real estate business. It was a cult of vocabulary.
Neumann's formally stated guiding mission wasn't to rent office desks. It was, quote, to elevate the world's consciousness.
That's incredible.
He described the enterprise as a capitalist kibbutz, aiming to solve global loneliness by generating a physical social network.
He wrapped a highly traditional, incredibly high-friction subleasing model in the infinite scale vocabulary of a tech company. And the investors were entirely intoxicated by this semantic void.
They bought it completely.
They poured billions in, valuing the company at $37 billion. That was a multiple of 26 times its projected revenue.
While legacy commercial real estate firms with identical physical constraints like IWG or Regus traded at a multiple of 0.5 to 2 times revenue. WeWork's valuation was physically impossible based on the actual operations of leasing concrete and glass.
So, if WeWork wasn't a tech company, what was it physically? The text gives us another rigorous physics classification.
Through the lens of organizational multiphysics, WeWork was a highly inefficient, open dissipative structure.
Open dissipative structure.
This is a concept coined by Nobel laureate Ilya Prigozhin. A dissipative structure describes a thermodynamically open system operating far from equilibrium. To maintain its complex internal order and stave off entropy, it must constantly exchange energy and matter with its external environment.
Okay.
It must import massive amounts of high-quality energy just to survive.
And this introduces 2 incredibly important thermodynamic concepts. Exergy and anergy. Let's break those down.
In advanced thermodynamics, total systemic energy is mathematically divided into exergy and anergy. Exergy is the high-quality component of energy available to be converted into useful work.
Exergy is good.
Right. Energy is the dead component, the waste heat that cannot perform useful work and is irreversibly lost to the environment.
So WeWork was a global incinerator of exergy.
Yes.
They imported vast amounts of high-quality exergy in the form of venture capital from SoftBank. Billions of dollars. But because they ignored their own physical constraints, the system possessed fatal thermodynamic leaks.
The most fatal leak was the duration mismatch. They took on $47 billion in fixed 10-year long-term lease liabilities, but they funded those massive, rigid liabilities with chaotic, short-term, 30-day tenant contracts.
I want to really ground this abstract physics intangible reality.
Yeah, let's look at an example.
Let's look at one specific WeWork building. Imagine the exergy, the venture capital money flowing in to rent this massive concrete building, to buy the glass walls, the leather couches, the kombucha taps.
Right.
The setup that is high-quality energy creating physical order. But the second a tenant leaves after their 30-day contract is up, that desk sits empty. The air conditioning is still running.
The lights are still on.
Yes. The massive 10-year lease must still be paid every single month. That ordered energy immediately decays into waste heat energy. The physical building is literally bleeding out the venture capital.
Exactly. You cannot fund a 10-year concrete liability with a 30-day subscription. Every time they expanded their footprint, they generated massive irreversibilities. They destroyed exergy and converted it directly into anergy.
Because it didn't scale.
There were zero scale effects. The system wasn't becoming more efficient as it grew. It was simply getting larger and producing exponentially more waste heat. Their operational losses kept exact pace with their top-line revenue growth.
And to hide this brutal thermodynamic reality, WeWork invented an accounting metric of pure deception: community-adjusted EBITDA.
Unbelievable metric.
This metric claimed to measure profitability by literally excluding the cost of the physical buildings, the rent, the utilities, the internet, the building staff's salaries. They magically erased the physical supply chain from the balance sheet.
It was essentially earnings before everything else. They were basically saying, if you completely ignore the physics of what we do, we're incredibly profitable. But as Hutunen ruthlessly points out, a metaphor cannot pay a commercial lease. Poetry does not lower interfacial tension. When the exergy stops flowing, the dissipative structure collapses.
When the macroeconomic environment shifted and the external flow of high-quality VC capital ceased, the dissipative structure could no longer operate. The mathematical reality of those 10-year leases violently crushed Neumann's metaphor of elevated consciousness.
It is inevitable.
WeWork failed because it was managed by metaphor instead of physics. Thermodynamics always, without exception, wins against poetry.
Thermodynamics called their bluff, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, listeners must rigorously audit their own companies for adjusted reality.
Yes.
Stop celebrating top-line revenue growth if your operational losses are scaling at the exact same rate. That means your system lacks scale effects. You are merely incinerating exergy to generate energy. Never fund rigid, long-term structural liabilities with chaotic, short-term energetic inputs.
So what does this all mean? We have diagnosed the linguistic hallucination. We have translated the poetic metaphors into their brutal biological and physical realities. We have seen a $47 billion company collapse under the weight of its own semantic void. How do we synthesize all of this into something we can take into the office tomorrow?
The ultimate mandate for the executive is to declare martial law over the corporate lexicon.
Martial law.
The epistemic transition cannot be delegated to the HR department. The architecture of your language is the literal architecture of the firm.
8 stands before his steering committee on Monday morning, and he permanently bans the use of terms like culture, synergy, bandwidth, and vibe.
He just outlawed them.
If a leader deploys language that lacks a physical or mathematical definition, they are interrupted and forced to reframe the variable. Because if the leader cannot describe the mechanics of the problem, they do not understand the problem.
You must sever compensation from waste heat. Evaluate leadership exclusively on mechanical work output, force times displacement.
W equals F times D.
Engineer translucent Markov blankets to protect the biological myelin of your high-leverage nodes from Landauer's erasure, and eradicate thermodynamic fraud like adjusted EBITDA from your reporting.
Here is the direct call to action for you, the listener. The next time you're sitting in a meeting and someone uses a buzzword, the next time they talk about finding synergy or spinning plates or grabbing low-hanging fruit, I want you to ask them to translate it into physical constraints.
Ask them for the exact displacement.
Yes, ask them for the variable D. If they cannot define the physical displacement, tell them they are generating waste heat.
Returning to the uncompromising reality of mass, energy, and displacement is the only way to avert systemic collapse.
This has been an incredibly heavy, dense analysis, but remember, this is only part 2 of our 8-part series.
We're just getting started.
Next time, we are moving the diagnostic from the corporate entity out to the macro environment. We're going to unpack the global heat death and the terrifying thermodynamic reality hidden inside the 2025 Gallup data. You will not want to miss that.
It scales the thermodynamic failure from the boardroom to a societal level.
Exactly. We spent the last hour talking about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, how the language you use mathematically limits your perception of reality, and we applied it to massive supply chains and boardrooms.
Right.
But think about this on a deeply personal level. If the casual metaphors used in a corporate boardroom can physically destroy a $40 billion logistics network by rewriting the cognitive limits of its leaders, what physical realities are you inadvertently building or destroying in your own personal life with the metaphors you use to describe your habits, your relationships, and your self-worth?
Wow.
Thermodynamics doesn't care about corporate culture, but it doesn't care about your personal narratives either. You're a biological system. What words are limiting your reality?
The linguistic hallucination happens at home, too.
And I want to leave you with a chilling extrapolation that builds on this source material. We haven't fully unpacked this yet, but we must address the incoming threat of generative AI.
Oh. This is the perfect extension of the lexical phase shift. How does AI fit into this thermodynamic model?
Think about the mechanics. If a business is a literal physical system, but we are increasingly saturating our corporate networks with AI-generated text models. Models that are designed to output statistically probable but operationally empty filler words.
Oh, wow.
Words like leverage, optimize, facilitate. Think about what that actually means mechanically for the enterprise.
Wait, because the AI is just predicting the next most likely corporate buzzword, it isn't making us more efficient. It is generating infinite metaphors.
Precisely. Under the FEINSYS framework, AI is acting as a massive entropy accelerant. It is exponentially increasing the semantic void, creating mountains of perfectly grammatical gibberish that requires human ATP to read, decode, and discard.
It's draining our batteries.
It is flooding the communication channels, degrading the Markov blankets, and hastening the thermal decay of the enterprise. It is a thermodynamic nightmare, something to deeply consider before you use a language model to auto-generate your next strategy email.
Wow. If the labels on the control room buttons were gibberish before, AI is just printing thousands of new meaningless buttons every single second.
What if the biggest existential threat from AI isn't, a rogue nuclear launch code, but like a calendar invite asking you to circle back on synergies?
Right, yeah.
If we are trying to build these hyper-efficient, super capable systems, why are we feeding them a diet of empty HR jargon in the first place?
Well,
it feels like training a gladiator by forcing them to sit in a cubicle and read synergy reports. Don't developers actively filter out the useless fluff before the model trains on it?
You'd assume that, sure.
So the mathematically safest path for the model is just to use sanitized buzzwords.
Pretty much.
I can't even argue with that.
Keep your signal clear and your friction low. Thank you for joining part 2 of this 8-part journey. We will see you next time as we dive deeper into the physics of human organization.